The Concept of Cause in African Thought by Godwin S. Sogolo. One of the puzzles yet unresolved by scholars seeking to understand traditional African belief systems is how, in the explanation of observable events, disembodied or non-extended entities, spirits, witches, ghosts, gods, etc., existing beyond the confines of space, can possibly invoked as causes. The problem arises mainly due to the widespread mechanistic view of causality in which when C is said to be the cause of E, a necessary connection is assumed to exist between C and E in accordance with certain scientific principles subsumed under a general law. The literature on causality has appreciably expanded since Hume substituted his constant conjunction for necessary connection, thereby denying cause and effect that connective power thought to exist between them. I do not intend here to go into a philosophical excursus of all this, neither about what counts as a cause or an effect, nor about what constitutes a causal explanation in the scientific sense. Those concerned with these technical analyses would agree that the notion of causality is now so loose and varied in meaning that what counts as a causal explanation of an event would depend on factors such as 1. The nature of the event to be explained, 2. Our interest in the event, 3. Whether the event has one cause or a multiplicity of necessary causes, 4. Whether when the causes are more than one, they can be compatibly invoked, 5. Whether some of the causes are sufficient such that the others become unnecessary and superfluous, etc. One other possibility is to conceive of a causal explanation as the sum total of a variety of possible causes, which in some cases are indefinite. In all, what seems obvious is that there are different conceptions of what constitutes a causal explanation. In this discussion, I examine the nature and function of the varying explanatory models in traditional African thought, based on a distinction drawn between two basic notions of causality, the primary non-mechanistic and the secondary mechanistic. I analyze the corresponding features of two explanatory models which quite often appear to be mutually exclusive. I then attempt to show that the two kinds of explanation perform different functions which are complementary and non-mutually exclusive. With specific examples drawn from an African approach to the explanation of diseases, I then show how a combination of both the mechanistic and the non-mechanistic explanatory models provides a fuller, more comprehensive understanding than the exclusive use of either. At first it would appear that claims in traditional African thought do not fall within the category of explanations generally associated with science-oriented thought systems. The reason for this is obvious. In seeking to understand events, as Horton points out, the prevalent explanatory models adopted by a given culture are determined by the peculiarities of that culture. Horton's main interest is to compare the forms of explanation in traditional African thought with those of Western science. His comparison is based on what he observes as essential similarities between the two thought systems. One essential similarity is that in both models one finds two distinct but complementary levels of thought and discourse, which Horton labels as the common sense and the theoretical, or primary theory and secondary theory. More specifically, what Horton regards as fundamental similarities in the explanatory models of the two systems are firstly, that both are primarily concerned with explanation, prediction, and control of natural phenomena, and secondly, that in doing so they invoke theoretical entities, albeit of different kinds. Horton, however, points out what he regards as a superficial differential based on the idiom or expression as derived from the cultural contexts, that science involves impersonal theoretical entities, while traditional thought draws on personal theoretical entities. Our concern here is not with Horton's general points of similarity and difference between traditional African thought and Western thought. His ideas have been severely criticized and it is difficult to say who is right, Horton or his opponents. Surely Horton is not wrong in his observation that all human societies, traditional or modern, have two levels of discourse, that of primary theory and that of secondary theory. He is also right about the basic characteristics he assigns to these levels of thought. As Horton explains, the entities and processes of primary theory are thought of as directly given to the human observer, while those of secondary theory are thought of as somehow hidden. He also thinks that primary theory lacks the push-pull causal vision largely associated with secondary theory. In all, Horton's distinction boils down to nothing but the difference between common sense explanation involving the use of material object language and theoretical explanation involving hidden mechanisms not susceptible to observable language. The layman's explanation of day-to-day events both in traditional Africa and the modern West stands for Horton's primary theory, although it is not clear why the term theory is appropriate at this level. At the level of secondary theory, Horton thinks that traditional African religious explanations occupy the position which scientific explanations occupy in the West. His main concern, therefore, is to compare and contrast the two modes of thought at the secondary level, and as far as doing this is concerned, Horton's enterprise appears harmless, although it could be argued that any reason one might have for comparing traditional African religious thought with Western science should also serve as a reason for comparing Western religious thought, traditional or modern, with Western science, since by Horton's own classification, all religious forms are to be seen as secondary theoretical schemes. What is of substance to us here in relation to Horton's comparative analysis is the claim he makes that although traditional thought and Western science are concerned with the explanation, prediction, and control of natural phenomena, the former is more successful in achieving these objectives than the latter. Surely the question of success or failure here depends on the functions assigned to the two modes of thought. Horton's assumption is that both traditional African thought and Western science are concerned with explanation, prediction, and control of natural phenomena, but part of this basic premise is questionable. It is true that traditional African thought seeks to explain events and create order and regularity where there seems to be discord and irregularity, as Horton would put it. From this, we may also agree that both share in common the goal of prediction, since knowledge of past and present events may serve as a basis for predicting future ones. But we may understand past and present events and be able to predict future ones without any interest or motivation directed at control. By their nature, traditional African explanatory models, unlike those of science, are not intended for the control of natural phenomena. One is tempted, no doubt, for example, to interpret oracular practices and belief in divination as efforts by traditional African practitioners to change the order of nature. This is mistaken. The practitioner claims to be able to foretell the course of future events, and his or her prescription to a client is mainly one of how to avert such events. The practitioner does not attempt to change, stop, or control the normal course of events. The order of nature is believed to be laid down, and it is not subject to change by mortals. However, it is believed that any human being adequately informed about such events can avert them by moving beyond their reach. By way of analogy, what the African diviner aims at is similar to the objectives of modern preventative medicine. In orthodox preventative medicine, the practitioner merely seeks to protect a client from being afflicted by certain diseases. The practitioner knows that his or her client could catch malaria when bitten by the appropriate parasite-carrying mosquito. What he or she does, therefore, when prescribing a weekly dose of chloroquine, is not to stop that parasite from causing malaria, but to ensure that the client is not predisposed to this disease. In the same way, the traditional African diviner claims to know that events of misfortune will always occur. He or she cannot stop them from occurring, but claims to be able to ensure that a client is not predisposed to such events. When the practice of divination in traditional Africa is seen in this way, it is clear, contra Horton, that traditional explanatory models are not intended for control of natural phenomena. The more crucial point about the issue of success or failure of an explanatory model depends, as we said earlier, on the nature of the event to be explained and our interest in that event. In particular, the interest one has in an event influences and determines what one would regard as its cause, which makes it possible for a given event to be given a variety of causal explanations that are not necessarily mutually exclusive of one another. Troxell and Snyder have provided an interesting example of how a single event could attract different causal explanations. They take an imaginary incident of a fire breaking out, which has caused considerable damage and whose cause is undetermined. Troxell and Snyder make us imagine that in the course of investigating the cause of the fire, firefighters found that little children were playing with matches in the garage and that one of them, Bobby Jones, confessed to having lit a match which led to the fire breaking out. Now, according to Troxell and Snyder, the firefighters, in writing their report on the incident, would say children playing with matches caused the fire. Their primary interest in the matter, as people whose profession it is to prevent the occurrence of fire breaking out, is to find out the kinds of human action that led to the fire. whether it was a case of arson, careless acts of drunken adults, children playing with matches, etc. It is supposed further that a physicist was involved in the investigation. According to the authors, the physicist's explanation of the cause of the fire would not only be different in kind, but would include details which were of no interest to the firefighters. The physicist's report might say, for instance, that the fire was caused by a match being placed very close to some old newspaper, which was, in turn, next to some cardboard boxes. He or she might even go further to explain the physical compositions of the materials involved, how their combustion was aided by the flow of certain gases, and why fire had to spread in certain directions and not others, etc. It is not that firefighters are ignorant of these details. These are simply not matters of interest to them, just as the aspect of the incident that has to do with human action is not of interest to the physicist. So, in providing an explanation for the fire, we could say that for the firefighters, the cause was children playing with matches, while for the physicist, the cause was the ignited match. But as Troxell and Snyder rightly point out, the firefighter's explanation and that of the physicist are not in conflict. They simply complement each other in providing more details in the explanation of the fire outbreak. However, let us suppose further, say the authors, that a psychologist or a social worker was interested in the fire. The psychologist might be interested in the factors that could have led to the children, particularly Bobby Jones, to the habit of playing with matches. He or she might find out that Bobby Jones's parents used to entertain him with match tricks. Or a social worker might look into the domestic circumstances that might possibly have led to these children being left alone. He or she could find out that their parents were so poor that material pursuit took so much of their time that the children were ignored. Both the psychologist and the social worker are thus likely to say that the parents were indeed the cause of the fire. Troxell and Snyder even extended the example with more interesting elaborations. The anti-smoking campaigner, who, believing that smokers are in the habit of leaving matches around that their children play with, could explain that smoking was the cause of the fire. They even refer to the apparently remotest of possible causes, the position that a fundamentalist preacher might take, namely, that the birth of the children is the cause of the fire, since if they had not been born in the first place, the incident would not have occurred. Our interest in the details of the fire example is twofold. Firstly, it shows the almost infinite kind of causal explanation that can be given for a single event, and because the explanations are of different sorts, the question of the superiority of one over the other is misplaced. The explanations provided by the firefighters, the psychologist, social worker, anti-smoking campaigner, and the fundamentalist preacher might appear to be out of tune with what, in scientific terms, is accepted as a causal explanation, but it is so only from the point of interest of the scientist. Besides, there is no consensus among scientists about the notion of causality or what should count as an adequate causal explanation. The second crucial point about the example we have chosen is that the different explanations are complementary and non-mutually exclusive. In some sense, the chain of causes that led to the fire could be traced to the birth of the children, such that there is plausibility in saying that the birth of the children caused the fire. And if it were true, as the psychologist or social worker would claim, that the children's habit of playing with matches was acquired due to faults in their upbringing, faults caused by their parents, then there is also a sense in which the parents could be said to be the cause of the fire. All these causes do not exclude the fact that the children and the match are also the causes of the fire. This way, the causes of the fire number as many as the interests of those who seek to provide an explanation for it. And where causes do not exclude one another, we might say that when put together they constitute an adequate or complete explanation of the fire incident. However, normally no problems would arise if the different explanations, causal or otherwise, of a given event or phenomenon were to share this complementary relationship. Problems arise when, as we said earlier, multiple causes are invoked as explanations, with some either incompatible with or rendering others superfluous. The history of science is replete with instances of phenomena that were at one time explained in supernatural terms, but which, at the dawn of experimental science, had their scientific principles fully uncovered by scientists. In such instances, one could say that their scientific explanations either mutually exclude their supernatural interpretations, or that the former have rendered the latter superfluous. This is what the growth of knowledge means, a gradual process of explaining phenomena that were at one time either inexplicable or inadequately explained. Within a given culture, it is generally assumed that the new explanations are true while those they replace are false, or that the new ones are superior to the old ones. But as we have just seen, this is misleading since the explanations, although different in kind, may not necessarily stand as incompatible alternatives. In fact, the question of comparative truth value, or superiority of some over others, does not arise because of the difference in their explanatory functions. In traditional African thought, this non-commensurability in explanatory functions is most clearly manifest in the people's mode of explaining the causes of illness. Of course, in every culture, what counts as an acceptable explanation of illness is tied to the people's general conception of health and disease. To a great extent, it is dependent on their overall worldview. The firm assumption has always been that African cultures hold a holistic conception of disease or illness. People are considered ill if they display a state of unusual feeling, suffering pain or incapacitation, or being in danger of death or mutilation. One's day-to-day life activities, example the ability to work or to perform other social duties, are affected by this general feeling. Such a person is said to be ill, whether or not the causes are traceable to specific structural changes in the cells of the body. This holistic conception of health and illness, which may be considered unorthodox in modern medical practice, is firmly held among the Yoruba community of Nigeria. The Yoruba word alafia, which translates as health, according to Ademowagun, embraces the totality of an individual's physical, social, psychological, and spiritual well-being in his total environmental setting. Contrary to the claim by Lewis that it is the presence of disease that can be recognized, not the presence of health, the Yoruba believe that both states are recognizable, and in a negative terminology, they conceive of illness as aisan, which translates as the absence of health. Again, their holistic conception of health and sickness is reinforced when the Yoruba speak of the former state as when ara, body, is strong and active, and of the latter when ara, body, is broken down. The main indicator of health or disease in Yoruba thought is thus the ability or inability to perform one's routine work, or adequate or inadequate performance. An important aspect of the African conception of health and illness is that it is the whole human body, not merely certain parts of the body, that is considered either well or in a state of disease. Unlike in the West, where a patient consulting a physician often hints as to what part of the body he or she thinks is afflicted, the traditional African, except in the case of easily identifiable anatomical parts of the body or where there are external injuries due to an accident, is generally non-specific as to the part of the body afflicted by disease, and the healer who is consulted does not press for such specific information. This non-specificity in associating diseases with parts of the body is clear from the fact that generally traditional healers do not start their diagnosis of illness by a physical examination of the patient's body. Their primary concern is with the patient's background in socio-cultural and in divine supernatural relations. Thus, a given illness or disease is generally explained by reference to several causes, some of which, in modern scientific thought, appear to be logically incompatible. An African healer may attribute a disease to a scientific natural cause, not too dissimilar to the germ theory of modern medicine. Yet the healer may also believe that the same disease is caused by supernatural forces, and would then proceed to cure the disease in these two seemingly incompatible ways. Normally, any such conception of illness that appeals to supernatural forces, deities, spirits, witchcraft, etc., is classified as a form of animism, which, in fact, is common in the history of every society. For example, early medical practice in Scotland took this form where, according to M. Clow, healing lay in propitiating the powers, supernatural, against which the patient might have offended. Such supernatural factors play an important role in almost all pre-literate, ancient and contemporary societies of the world. It is common for modern scientific thinkers to read irrationality into the supernatural approach to medical healing. However, in relation to the African conception of health and illness, this impression is misleading. Although apparently animistic in outlook, the traditional African conception of disease or illness conforms at least in part with the basic norms of modern medical practice. I shall return to this point shortly. Basically, the causes of illness in traditional African thought fall into two major categories: the primary and the secondary. Care must be taken here not to confuse these two arms of explanation with Horton's broad distinction between levels of theoretical discourse. For clarity and ease of analysis, our primary and secondary causes are to be seen as a subdivision within Horton's category of secondary theory. Primary causes of illness are those predisposing factors not directly explicable in physical terms. Some of these take the form of supernatural entities such as deities, spirits, and witches. Others are stress-induced, either as a result of the victim's contravention of communal morality or his or her strained relationships with other persons within the community. Secondary causes, on the other hand, involve direct causal connections, similar to the cause-effect relations of the germ theory in orthodox modern medicine. If, for instance, a person is suffering from stomachache, acute diarrhea, and vomiting, that person is suspected of having eaten poisoned food. It has been reported that in Yoruba, ete, leprosy, is spread either by spiders or through chewing sticks on which flies have landed, or by drinking local gin. The Yoruba concept kokoro, synonymous with germ in English, suggests that there are in the culture non-metaphysical causal explanations of disease. Such explanations may lack the theoretical details of modern medicine, but they are, in principle, similar in diagnoses in modern medicine, their truth or falsity being irrelevant. Our main concern here is with primary causes of illness and their relationship with secondary causes. Normally, any explanation that draws on supernatural forces is regarded as incompatible with the principles of science upon which modern medicine rests. In fact, the scientist would see such an explanation as a direct violation of the principles of science. The connection between the two is always missed. Yet modern medical practitioners would find the connection difficult to deny. They would agree, for instance, that stress reduces the natural resistance of the body against certain diseases, such that people in a state of stress are more susceptible to their affliction than those not socially disturbed. It is perhaps important to distinguish the African conception of stress from the way it is conceived in the West. A business executive in the West could suffer from stress if his or her business were on the verge of collapse. A heavy day's work without rest could lead him or her into such a state, or anxiety over possible contingencies could make the executive suffer from stress. In traditional Africa, stress is mainly due to a strained relationship, either with one's spiritual agents or with other persons within one's community. It could also be due to a feeling of guilt arising from a breach of communal norms. For example, in some African groups, if a man were involved in an adulterous act with his brother's wife, whether or not this act were detected, the person would undergo stress, having disturbed his social harmony. If he cheated his neighbor, was cruel to his family, or had offended his community, the anxiety that followed could take the form of phobias, either of bewitchment or of the affliction of diseases. Such a person would feel vulnerable, and his feeling alone could result in real vulnerability. The parallel to this in modern orthodox medicine is the practice whereby medical scientists explain certain diseases by a conjunction of the germ theory and the patient's reduced resistance due to stress. The possible difference between this and the corresponding primary and secondary explanations of traditional African thought is that Western medical science has at its disposal a well-systematized body of theories to follow, while the African system operates on a piecemeal basis of trial and error. It should be noted, however, that not all orthodox medical physicians are theoreticians in the scientific sense of the word. There are many whose practice is based on trial and error. They follow the germ theory without knowing or being able to articulate its mechanisms. In the same way, it could be said that the traditional African leader follows certain principles, although he or she is unable to say exactly what these principles are. Unlike the modern physician who has to rely almost entirely on the pharmacological efficacy of drugs, cure for the traditional African healer is directed towards the two targets of primary and secondary causes. The healer may be confident of the pharmacological activities of his or her herbs, but that is not all. The herbs are efficacious, the healer believes, only if the primary causes have been taken care of. The herbalist is thus also a diviner, which gives his or her profession a metaphysical outlook. But, again, this could be misleading. The point is that the primary causes result in the weakening of the defense mechanisms of the body. Cure in this respect simply means restoring the body to a state of increased capacity to heal itself, a state in which the pharmacological efficacy of the drugs is maximized. Again, there is a parallel of this kind of integrated approach in modern medical practice. The well-known placebo effect in orthodox medicine, in which confidence and positive belief on the part of either of the physician or the patient produces a favorable effect, is well nigh indistinguishable from the dual approach of the African healer. Belief here must be distinguished from the mere unquestioning faith of the religious type. It is a psychological overtone which leads to physically effective results, both in African and modern medicine. The patient's belief that the physician is competent and that the drug works helps to restore his or her body to a state of harmony with the applied drug. Psychological states, attitudes, and beliefs have been known to play significant roles in traditional African medicine. They now provide acceptable explanations for some of the ailments that have in the past been attributed mainly to supernatural forces. Carruthers claims that anxiety, for instance, which in Africa is believed to be an outcome of bewitchment, leads to phobias, whose physical symptoms take predominantly the forms of gastric and cardiac neuroses and of impotence. Anorexia nervosa, or something akin to this from time to time, may be fatal. Fears that the food is poisoned may initiate the syndrome, but its continuance is governed by a feeling, a disguised depression, that the unusual struggle has been lost and the time has come to die. It is clear from this why the diagnostic method is such that the primary cause, in this case bewitchment, believed to be the cause of anxiety, must be counteracted first, or simultaneously with the secondary cause. This, however, is not to say that the beliefs which inform the primary explanations are true, meaningful, or even rational. The important point is that the beliefs are, as a matter of fact, held. Also, that they play an important role in the diagnosis of illness, and that they affect the pharmacological activities of drugs. Rose stresses the importance of such beliefs in her critique of the orthodox approach in the psychiatric administration of psychotropic drugs. According to her, it can be established that if a person believes that he or she has a good reason to be anxious or depressed, this reason may not be rational or even expressible in words. The drug does not change his or her belief, and the effect of the belief overrides the effect of the drug. Psychotropic drugs, she contends, are like aspirin, which takes away the pain of toothache without healing the tooth. There are conceptual difficulties with any such account which draws simultaneously on both natural and non-natural forces. Where the non-natural forces are social or psychological factors, the problems may be adequately handled by a psychoanalyst. But in Africa, where the causes of illness are a blend of supernatural forces, gods, deities, spirits, etc., and natural forces, germs, parasites, kokoro, etc., the apparent difficulty that emerges is similar to the body-mind problem, a subspecies of the general issue of how a non-physical entity can possibly interact with a physical entity. I have argued elsewhere that a clear dichotomy between the natural and the supernatural does not exist in African thought. Even if it does, the apparent conflict in the people's explanations of illness may still be resolved by invoking the difference in principle between primary causes and secondary causes. It could be said that a healer in tropical Africa, attending to a patient suffering from, say, severe cerebral malaria, is aware, if only vaguely, that the patient's ailment is caused by a parasite, secondary cause. But in a culture where almost everybody suffers repeatedly from bouts of malaria and where the disease is normally not severe, it is obvious why the patient's consultation is bound to move beyond the how question to the why question. Why such a severe attack, and why me and not someone else? These are quests for primary causes beyond the level of the physical. Note that in searching for answers to these questions, unlike in Western cultures, the concept of chance hardly plays any significant role. The issues raised at the level of primary causes cannot be resolved by applying the canons of scientific reasoning. Indeed, viewed from the paradigm of science, some of the claims made are likely to sound meaningless, irrational, and false, if these terms are ever applicable. The crux of the matter is that the seeming conflict that exists between primary and secondary causes can be shown to be unreal, which is to say that there is no absurdity involved in an integrated diagnostic process which blends the natural with the supernatural, nor in a curative process involving the pharmacological activities of herbs and the appeasement of supernatural entities. The whole point of this excursus into the two-dimensional approach to causal explanation in African thought is to provide a parallel to the example of the fire outbreak cited earlier. In both cases, what stands as an acceptable explanation depends on our interests in the matter. Just as the conjunction of the explanations by the firefighters, the physicist, the psychologist, etc. provides a fuller explanation of the cause of the fire, so would the various ailments mentioned in MacLean's examples provide a fuller comprehension of the pharmacological powers of the drug.